Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to a very special edition of Informed Sources. From this program's beginning in 1984, our intent was to report on and to analyze the news of the present. We never thought we would be making history in the process. Yet here we are 35 years later in our familiar Friday night spot, and having become the longest-running non-daily news television now in New Orleans history. Here's how it all began.
The fair's finances, not a bright picture. A pessimistic governor is asking the state legislature to back a $15 million bank loan to the fair, and a New Orleans city councilman is asking for an investigation into the fair's operations. This to be discussed tonight by our Informed Sources. Good evening. I'm Marcia Cavanaugh Radlauer, and welcome to Informed Sources. Well, it was a week of disappointing news for the Louisiana World Exposition, also for Louisiana Power and Light. But it was also a week of some hopeful attempts to come up with a tax plan that would pay for teacher pay raises. Governor Edwards flatly stated that guarantors who pledged $40 million to back the World's Fair probably won't see that money. Meanwhile, Fair Director Peter Spurney blamed the press for throwing a damper on fair attendance. And LP&L was told by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that several questions have to be answered before the Waterford 3 nuclear plant goes online. Well, tonight our Informed Sources will talk about this, but first, Elizabeth Curran is here with New Orleans Council President Joe Giarrusso to talk about his call for an investigation into the fair's finances. Liz?
Marcy, Councilman Giarrusso is calling for an investigation into World's Fair finances to see if public funds have been mismanaged.
Well, that is fun to see, and my dear friend Elizabeth Curran, still my very, very close buddy. Well, to talk about the present now and look back at the history, tonight with me are, of course, Errol Laborde, the show's longtime producer and editor-in-chief of Renaissance Publishing. And now you see Dominic Massa. There we go. Executive producer of special projects for WWL TV Channel 4, whose hobbies include chronicling the history of local news business. And Dominic just put that little piece together. I'm going to see a little bit more further on the show. Dominic really helped assemble this special anniversary show for us, so thanks so much.
Honored to be here. Thank you.
Errol.
He also helped us know it was our anniversary, too.
That's right. He reminded us about that, too, and said, you got to have a show about this. So this wonderful show, Informed Sources, on for 35 years now. It was sort of it came out of a preceding show here at WYES.
It was a program called City Desk, and at the time, this was in the 70s, there were two newspapers. They'd all merged, but you had the Times-Picayune, which was the daily newspaper, and of course the Times-Picayune was the Times-Picayune. It was the big elephant out there and all that. But the States Item was a smaller paper, but it was the afternoon paper. It would be the last of the afternoon dailies. It was a little bit more lively, a little bit more fun, a little bit more outspoken in its politics, and it had a great weekend entertainment section. But it did this program, and Charlie Ferguson, who was the editor of the newspaper, would act as the moderator, and he would have reporters. And so it was really the staff of the States Item. But I thought it was a wonderful show, and the format was just sitting around talking. And seeing that show, I used to watch it faithfully every Friday night. It was a very exciting time. Moon Landrieu had just been elected mayor of New Orleans. And
we should say, that's Charlie Ferguson on the left,
right.
Alan Katz, and Bruce Egler.
That's right.
Yes.
And some of the other reporters would rotate, but Katz was pretty much a regular. I'll say this about Alan Katz, was seeing him, and one thing I admired about him is he was the first columnist I've been aware of who was, I guess, a political columnist by nature, but in writing about politics, he also blended in media and sports and the economy and all of the other factors. It just wasn't cutting, which of course you have to do to make sense of politics. You have to put all that together. And so I thought the conversation was wonderful. And it really made me, as a kid just out there just watching it, never realizing one day I'd be involved in the show, really a believer in what good conversation can do. If you just sit around and you ask questions and you have people talk, it could be very, very informative. And a little bit later, it expanded to an hour. And when it expanded to an hour, they started doing field pieces and, out in the field. And it just wasn't the same thing. I just missed the four guys sitting around, and they were guys for the most part, sitting around talking. But it was a very useful show. It ended rather abruptly, but there was some kind of fallout, and the exact reason has never been known, but it was a big loss.
1971 to 78, so that's the time period. And I have a great quote from Charlie Ferguson, who was associate editor of the States item and then moderator. "You have to go out of your way not to have glamour," he said on the show. You changed that, Marcia, later. Yeah. But you go after someone who knows what he's talking about, and you enhance the credibility thereby. The idea is to make a brief presentation and then to draw the group into a discussion. The underlying concept, which is the same as today, is journalists sitting around talking, basically.
And the formula, a show like this belongs on a Friday evening. It belongs early on a Friday evening. It belongs in a half hour, and people just talking the news for a half hour on a Friday evening. I think that's key to the formula. And the other key, of course, is having informed people, who are doing the talking. There was this time in the late 70s when TV stations around the country were starting this magazine journal concept. I think the FCC had changed their rules and it is prime time access hour. I know Channel 4 started it, and that's when Eric Paulson first came in and all that. And Channel 12 started a journal program also, and that replaced Stepping Out. And journal, again, it was a magazine thing. It was a fancy thing. You saw people
City Desk.
But what? I'm sorry.
Replace City Desk. Not
I'm sorry. Yeah, replace City Desk. But again, it just wasn't the same type of program. So I was really thrilled a few years later when I got a call from Marcia and saying that she was trying to bring a show like City Desk back and working on it. And I was I was all for it.
Well, I had been briefly on staff on WYES staff in the early 80s after leaving WDSU, and then got married, starting my family, and I was asked to do a documentary on the history of New Orleans, which I did. And then after that, Julius Kane, who was director of broadcasting at that time, said, we kind of want to bring back that talk format about news like City Desk was. What about putting something together? So that's what we did. We came up with Informed Sources. The name was sort of something that he and I put together. He had either the sources or the informed. I can't remember who had what, but it wound up with informed. Right. The idea was to get people who really knew what the news was about, and that was the reporters who was covering the news. And so the idea was the same, really, to give the reporter a chance to get more into that story.
And this is that was either the first show, one of the first, you said, with Dennis Waltering, Clancy Dubose, Gary Eastland, who became a fixture from Gambit, a fixture here, and Liz Curran, of course.
And Elizabeth. And Elizabeth came in as the person who would do the interviews with the newsmakers. And the reason why I wanted to do that, it was always wonderful to work with Elizabeth, and she too was a new mom, and so we were anxious to work together. But I was concerned about whether or not the reporters would fill a half hour. Well, that definitely was not the need to worry about that. They easily fill in the half hour because I'm usually doing this to them so that they can wrap up. But that's really how it started. And then the music, the theme has stayed the same all this time too.
Tell us about the theme. People love the theme. So
Dr. William Coleman, Dr. Bill Coleman. Hi, Bill. Dear friend from that long time back, and we were all in a band together, and I asked him to come up with a theme for us, and that's what he did. So that's Bill Coleman on his synthesizer doing all of the parts, and it's been there for 35 years. And I remember when the show first came on the air, this one woman came up to me at a restaurant I recall saying, "Oh, we love that theme. We dance around the living room every time we hear it." So that's what I always think. That woman dancing around her living room.
Once the show started, it was nonstop. Through all the years, and when there was the brief Katrina interruption, that Friday night before Katrina, we did the show, and I remember thinking that that things seemed upbeat. They had just announced federal cities. They had just announced that there was going to be a Trump Tower in New Orleans. And I remember we were talking after, saying, things really seem upbeat tonight. And somebody says, yeah, but there's a hurricane in the Gulf. We came back because the station was flooded. We came back that January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, symbolically. And for a few weeks we were doing it out of WLAE. out on Causeway. And then there were a couple of shows we did out of a television studio at Dillard University that one of the staff members had discovered. It was a wonderful studio. It was a wonderful facility. I could have done commercial TV, and then finally we were back here.
Well, a long run and going through various things over those years. And I think of you. Errol now is the producer and a long-time producer of the show. There you see Errol when he came on to do some interviews in the Newsmaker slot too, with the Newsmaker. That's Moon Landry, yeah. But I just remember those early days of putting the show together each week, and it seems easier than it is. I mean, it really takes a lot of work and determination and
juggling schedules,
fortitude to try to, really sort of herd cats and trying to get the reporters together at the time that, that we can all do the show together. And that's what Errol does every week. Yeah. And he does a great job.
I guess it's fair to mention that early in the show's life that the management of the Times-Picayune chose not to allow its reporters, that they said, well, no, these people work for us. They should be reporting for us. And so we pleaded, wrote letters, we begged, and so, but for a while we were without the reporter. And so most of the reporters you'd have seen on the show, because the Picayune was it as far as a daily newspaper, were from television or radio or from alternatives like Gambit newspaper. Once the situation happened with the Picayune, when it changed to 3 times weekly, then the Advocate came in, then both papers were very willing to come in. And I've always liked newspaper reporters because newspaper reporters are really specialists in their field. And so to be able to get with the mix of newspaper reporters along with the best of the TV reporters, and so the field has gotten richer ever since 2012 when, when the Picayune changed.
One of the best things for both newspaper and broadcast journalists is the chance to talk more than a minute 30,
right.
To talk more than just what's in the newspaper, to give some perspective, to be able to actually expound on what you've covered. And that's been the beauty of it all along.
And that's the comment that so many times people come up to me and say, oh, we love watching the show. And I got to tell you, anybody comes up to me, I really, really, really do appreciate, and I remember it. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. But that's the comment, is that, gosh, we get to learn so much more about the story from the reporters, and that was really the intent of the show to begin with. And so, of course, the show also focuses a lot on politics, because we certainly love our politics in this part of the world. And there's one guy who really contributed so much to political information for us.
In the early years of the show, a guy named John McGinnis, who was out of Baton Rouge, he had his own newspaper at one time, and he wrote for various sources. But he became, as much as we could get him, as much as we can convince him to drive in from Baton Rouge, really, he was our political voice, and really, he was just so good. He knew politics so well. He had a slight Southern drawl. He had a real wit to him. He was born in Baton Rouge, stayed in Baton Rouge. He could have been a national prominence in the news media, but his life was in Baton Rouge, and his interpretation, his understanding was unbelievable. And one line that I'll always remember from him was that he said that the legislature could have done less, but they ran out of time. So.
He was great, and like you said, his wit was just really incredible, but his insight and his knowledge. He was just invaluable to the political scene, insight into the political scene, and to inform sources overall.
And his seat, it's something that nobody knows, but his seat was at the end of this desk to the right. It was a different podium at the time, but it was always at that far end. And to this day, we've always made that, especially when we're talking politics, we always put the political person in the McGinnis seat.
So there you see, when you see somebody at the end, they're going to talk politics for the most part.
Real quick, John Hill also, I know it was from day one almost, and John Hill, who is retired now, but the two Johns really were the strength of politics of this show, along with Errol, of course.
Well, with John Hill, he was good with Gannett newspapers.
But the daily coverage of the legislature and of that, both of them really strong.
John Hill was one of the first calls that I made. When I was beginning to assemble the stable of reporters to get the show going, and John was one of the first. You have put together, Dominic, as you do so beautifully, a montage of the folks who have sat at this desk over the years.
Well, my thought was, there have been so many great names, so many great journalists that have been on this program. Not all of them were tailor-made for television, as I'm not, but they all sat at this spot and gave their thoughts on the news. And so I thought, well, what if we had them all in one show? What if they were all together. So put together this compilation of some of the greatest, the Mount Rushmore of informed
With the
sources.
various anchors over time.
Yes, we should mention with the various anchors. So Marcia started it, and then Warren Bell took over for you from WU and WDSU, and then Larry Lorenz for many years from Loyola University.
many years, yeah.
And Loyola is where the archives are housed of a lot of these old programs because of the connection
Right.
with Dr. Lorenz are at Loyola's library.
Okay, let's take a look.
Let me introduce you to our informed sources tonight. We'll get right to the discussion. Ron Ridnour is with us. He is the investigative reporter with Gambit, New Orleans weekly newspaper. Pierre Degree, reporter with WDSU TV's News Center 6.
Tonight's informed sources, including my timeless, irreplaceable sidekick each week, producer of the program, Errol Laborde, Gary Easterlin, editor for Gambit, weekly newspaper here in New Orleans. From WWL Television News, Joe Duke, news director.
We'll be doing so with our own lineup of experts. Tonight's informed sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Mike Longman, reporter for WWL TV, Clancy Dubose, political reporter for WDSU TV, and Lee Stevenson, reporter for WVUE TV. Alan Johnson of the Louisiana Weekly, Richard Angelico, investigative reporter for WDSU TV, Channel 6, Sally Ann Roberts, reporter for WWL TV, Channel 4. From Baton Rouge, John McGinnis, publisher of Gree, Iris Kelso, columnist for the Times-Picayune, Bruce Egler, reporter for the Times-Picayune, Kathy Finn, editor of New Orleans City Business, Dave Cohen, reporter for WWL Radio, Mark Schleifstein, reporter for the Times-Picayune, Norman Robinson, news anchor for WDSU TV, Channel 6, and Rob Masson, reporter for WVUE TV, Channel 8. Kevin McGill, political reporter for the Associated Press. Bill Capo, reporter for WWL TV, Channel 4. And John Hill, Baton Rouge bureau chief for Gannett Newspapers. And Andre Trevine, news anchor for WWL Radio. Dave McNamara, reporter for WWL TV, Channel 4. Bruce Katz, chief meteorologist for WGNO TV, Channel 26. And Ro Brown, education reporter for WDSU TV, Channel 6. Stephanie Regal, reporter for WWL TV, Channel 4. Keith Allen, reporter for WDSU TV. Sabrina Wilson, reporter for WVUE TV, Channel 8. Jennifer John, reporter for WWL TV, Channel 4. And Dan Milham, meteorologist for WDSU TV, Channel 6. Keith Esperos, news director for WVUE TV, Channel 8. Mike Haas, anchor and reporter for WWL TV, Channel 4.
Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. Tyler Bridges, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL TV, Channel 4. Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Jeff Duncan, sports columnist, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. Meg Farris, medical reporter, WWL TV, Channel 4. And Kevin Litton, reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. Lee Zurich, investigative reporter, WVUE TV, Channel 8. Jessica Williams, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. Jason Berry, freelance journalist who has covered the Vatican. And Ramon Antonio Vargas, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. Gordon Russell, managing editor for investigations, The New Orleans Advocate. Katie Moore, investigative reporter, WWL TV, Channel 4. Jeff Adelson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. Catherine Sayer, reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. And Bob Breck, meteorologist, WVUE TV, Channel 8. Jeremy Alford, publisher, LaPolitics.com. Eric Paulson, reporter and anchor, WWL TV, Channel 4. And Kevin Allman, editor for Gambit. Fletcher Mackel, sports anchor, WDSU TV, Channel 6. And Travers Mackel, reporter, WDSU TV, Channel 6. Dennis Waltering, news anchor, WWL TV, Channel 4. James Gill, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. And Mike Pearlstein, investigative reporter, WWL TV, Channel 4.
Thank you very much for joining us. Time has run out very quickly. Thank you very much for joining us. Of course, we'll be back here again next week, next Friday night at 6:30.
I sure hope you're right, Errol. We hope you're with us again next week for our first Informed Sources program of the year 1987. Until then, I'm Warren Bell. Happy holidays, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
And thank you for being with us on Informed Sources. I'm Larry Lorenz. Be back again with us next week. Good night.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening. Well, that was fun, Dominic.
lineup, quite a
You
lineup,
did such a
yeah.
great job with that.
It's
Wasn't
easy
that
to do.
Just
wonderful?
for the record, when Warren Bell says, I sure hope you're right, Errol. I was right.
I did want to say the year-end shows were great to look at. It was a year in review and then lists that you would do each year. But there were always predictions from Joe Duke, former news director of Channel 4, that the Saints would win or have a winning season and go to the Super Bowl. He was never right until that year, but he wasn't on that year. But he always would predict that. So.
Okay, and you said the key word here, lists, because each of these guys have compiled lists to sort of go over who were the top newsmakers, what were the top news stories over these past 35 years. So we start with Dom first, the people.
You gave me the challenge of the people, but I think the great news stories are about great people, and so people that make the conversation, and good or bad, politics, business, etc. So beginning with number 10 on the list, Press Kabikoff. Along with his father, Lester Kabikoff, of course. The World's Fair was the big story of 1984, and of course many years after that, good and bad, but in terms of redevelopment, the riverfront, paving the way, the warehouse district, along with others, Joe Cannizzaro, Darrell Berger, and I would think if you sat here 35 years ago and said, people will one day be living in the American Can Company, or will be staying in a hotel where D.H. Holmes is, would you think that 35 years ago? So no. So that's,
Or we'd be going to
that's a
Walmart
change.
uptown.
That's true too. So. Again, a lot of development in these 35 years, and I give him credit for that.
Absolutely.
Next, Ron Foreman, another question of what would New Orleans be without the world-class Audubon Zoo? And of course, Ron Foreman been involved with the zoo and park for nearly 50 years as its CEO for the last many years. And of course, since then, the aquarium, the insectarium, the nature center, and so many wonderful things that have made New Orleans such a destination for family tourism as well. Another question, where would New Orleans be without Stephen Ambrose, Dr. Stephen Ambrose, and his vision for the D-Day Museum as it began, with the connection with the Higgins boats, the Higgins Industries,
Right,
and
and
D-Day.
of course his partner in crime
And
there,
Dr.
Nick Mueller. yeah.
Correct. So where would New Orleans be without that? Opened in 2000, as we know, and has seen more than 6 million visitors in that time. So if you're talking about the last 35 years, think about that contribution just since 1984 with the World War II Museum. Next, I call this female firsts, and took a little liberties and put 3 in one group in here. Dorothy May Taylor, Peggy Wilson, Kathleen Blanco. So females elected to government, local and then statewide. Dorothy May Taylor and Peggy Wilson, the first women on the city council, certainly were diametrically opposed on many issues, including the Mardi Gras controversy, the Mardi Gras discrimination ordinance. Peggy Wilson, though, also brought the 1988 Republican Convention, helped bring that to New Orleans. And then former Governor Blanco, her role in
Right.
the Katrina crisis and beyond that.
Okay, let's get to the others.
Number 6, Mark Morial. Some would say Dutch Morial should be on the list, but I thought he was sort of coming out of his time in 1984, and so I went with Mark as the next generation of leaders, and of course paved the way later for Mitch Landrieu,
Right.
and also Morial Harrod, Richard Pennington. Edwin Edwards, I was going to say that there probably wasn't a year during the 35 years of the program where Edwin Edwards wasn't discussed, good or bad, and so I mentioned him, just as certainly a power in state and politics there. Number 4, a name that would not have been on this list 35 years ago, or even a year or so ago, John Georges. But he has done so much for the local news landscape, and seismic shifts there, and certainly with the purchase of the Picayune, so he made my list. Number 3, Tom and Gail Benson. Tom Benson would have been on this list 35 years ago, since the Saints purchase was in 1985 when he bought the Saints. What a ride since then, and of course his wife Gail carried on his legacy and building her own legacy, which will be interesting to watch. LaToya Cantrell at number 2, first female mayor. Another one we'll have to watch and see how her story develops, but I gave her credit on this list for certainly her recent win with the infrastructure funding. Number 1, I called post-Katrina women leaders, and the rise of, certainly women were always leading the way, civic activism, but the Women of the Storm with Ann Milling and others, levees.org, Leslie Jacobs in education reform, and just the real, and also Carnival, Muses, women's cruise after Katrina.
Okay, Dom, quickly over to you.
Okay, these are the news stories. Whenever we do these kind of lists, I always want to include Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest, just because they're so big, so pervasive, have such an influence, dominate things so much during their 2 or 3 week period each year, and then we forget about them after it's over. They just kind of, it's like a balloon that just pops and you go away. But yet they're major influences in the culture and the style of New Orleans. Number 9, on the opposite side is crime. The one story that just wouldn't go away and is still out there. There have been some times when there were just some terrible murders, especially I remember one time there was like a shooting at a playground and like 7 people were murdered, and Ray Nagin saying, I'm going to spend the rest of my term trying to deal with this. It didn't quite work out. Number 8 was the expansion of tourism with the World War II Museum, with the cruise ship industry that's rebuilt, and now with the conversion of so many old buildings in the CBD into hotels. Number 7, the World's Fair, which was a dominant story in the early days. And as we all know, it was the locals loved it, financial failure, but we're still seeing the benefits with it, especially with Riverwalk and as things develop. Number 6, Downtown Revival, which is, again, those old buildings and the things that are happening, how they're being remade into something good. Number 5, Coastal Erosion. This is a story that's the ongoing story. We're still hearing about the losing those football fields every day and still looking for that solution. Number 4, the Saints super season. What a feel-good time that was. That was one time that just united everybody, and it was just a real thrill. 3, hospital expansion with the new University Hospital complex, which was one of the major building projects in the nation as it was being built, and now with Oxner and Children's Hospital all becoming major players, so it becoming an important center. Number 2, that awful weekend when Katrina arrived and the fear that we had. However, we thought it wouldn't last that long and we'd be back that Wednesday. But then we lived to tell. And really, the greatest story of this period, and one of the greatest stories in New Orleans history, is the Katrina revival and what's happened since then.
Boy, 2 great lists, guys, to really sort of encapsulate what's happened over these past 35 years. Now I'm going to ask you to tell us, what do you predict? What do you think is going to be coming up? What will reporters around this table be talking about, do you think, in years to come?
Okay. Well, I think that whole internet fad is going to die out like in about six months, and people.
That's a prediction for you. Yeah.
People will be back to typewriters in Western Union. But beyond that, I'm thinking in terms of the news media. There's going to be some changes, and we still have great reporting as we're getting now on investigative stuff and on big stories and things like the Saints. Where we're going to lose out, though, and thankfully that the Advocate is holding its ground, giving us a daily newspaper. But as the newspaper staff shrink, we're going to have less of the smaller stories. The beat reporter who's out covering the various boards and agencies and combing through their budgets, and so that level of news is going to fall out.
I predict that the 70th anniversary Informed Sources special edition will be 1 hour long because we could not fit all this into 30 minutes. No, as Errol said, the news, the coverage of the news, it's the format that's changing. People on their phones, mobile, internet. And actually there's more of a swing towards longer form. It's funny, that as attention spans you think get shorter, but really the long form, we do stories that are 10 minutes long, 8, 10 minutes long. Yeah. So there's still a need for that. How you convey it is the key in the question. And New Orleans has always been, as you know, a news town and a great place to cover news. And so there's always going to be something to cover. It's just how do you cover it?
Yeah, so it's always evolving, the gathering of it, the distribution of it, the consumption of it. And I predict that one thing that reporters are going to be talking more about, certainly around this table, is the coast, which you just mentioned, because that's an issue that's not going away, unfortunately, for us. Okay, so to wrap this up, what are we going to do, Dominic?
This is an anniversary, and like great birthdays and anniversaries, you need to have a cake.
Of course.
So we have a cake, special cake, and it's from one of the best bakeries in town, Swiss Confectionery.
Oh my goodness, I'm looking forward to that.
I did want to say, this sort of harkens to this other show I'm going to mention, but Informed Sources now tops Popeye and Pals as the longest running show in New Orleans television history.
Those of us
Popeyes
from
would
New
have
Orleans,
what?
from no Popeyes
Yes,
and
Popeyes
Pals.
chicken and assorted food that the children would eat. So we have a cake today to celebrate.
Okay, and I thank you, Dominic. Dominic put together all of this, including getting us the cake. And thank you, Errol. It's been wonderful being with you all of these years.
Marcia, you outlasted Uncle Henry, who used to host Popeyes and Pals.
Methuselah. Okay, thanks a
going.
lot. Thanks you guys for being here to enjoy this, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.